Everyone, thanks so much for joining. I'm Bobby. I'm the co-founder and CEO here at Elion. For those of you who haven't heard about Elion before, we are a healthcare technology marketplace. Our goal is essentially to make it easier for healthcare organizations to discover, evaluate, and select the right technology solutions for their business. Today, we're going to take a step back and dive into the question of build versus buy in the context of generative AI. To date, as folks probably get the sense, much of the conversation around genAI solutions is centered on which vendors and which products to select. But increasingly, we're finding that organizations are more interested in building their own solutions in-house, whether it's to tailor the solution to their own specific needs because it's cheaper, or frankly, because they think they can do it better. So to dig into this further, we've been fortunate to be able to bring together three product leaders, each of whom are leading internal build initiatives in their respective companies. So with that, I'll turn it over to the panelists to introduce themselves. Nikhita, I'll start with you.
Yeah. My name is Nikhita Luthra. I'm a senior product manager at Oscar Health. Fun fact about me is that I actually used to be on the data science team at Oscar Health, which is really fun for AI work because I get to wear both hats of a product person and a data person, which is great.
Awesome. Ford, do you want to go?
So Ford Kerr, I'm the head of AI and automation at Soar Autism Center. So Soar is a multi-site autism therapy group delivering ABA therapy to kids 2 to 6 years old, roughly, based in Denver. And yeah, so my job is to basically help our organization take advantage of emerging technology and AI and automation.
Cool. My name is Matthew Wu. I'm one of the co-founders of Summer Health and lead all things product. Spent 10 years, maybe now 11, getting old, in the business messaging space. And prior to Summer Health was leading the business messaging platform team at WhatsApp. And I'm really excited to be here because, one of the visions for Summer Health was always to, be such an accessible form of care that we had a mass amount, so much data that we could actually build a co-pilot, and to have that vision pulled forward by, it almost feels like 5 years to maybe even 7 years. It's really exciting. So happy to share some of the insights.
Awesome. Well, Matthew, why don't we stay with you just to kick things off? And so maybe, I think it's helpful up front just to clarify what building a Gen AI solution in-house actually means in practice. So I'd love to hear just what do you see as some of the common steps, and if there are any examples kind of from your own experience that you think would be helpful to highlight, feel free to dig in.
Yeah, I think that the building a Gen AI health solution internally involves a couple of components. I think the first one is actually directly interfacing with the foundational language model. So whether that be GPT or Anthropic's or even Meta LM from Google, I think being able to interface with that model, not necessarily building the entire foundation model. The second thing is to actually, I guess the common term is prompt engineering, but really it's context tuning, because the context windows now are no longer 10,000 tokens. It can be millions of tokens. And so really building kind of tuning there. And then finally interface being the API interface, which to actually trigger and then actually output it somewhere that's useful, that improves both the clinical workflow in terms of efficiency and quality. And so I think if you can have some semblance of these three components put together, at least in my perspective, that's what I would consider a Gen AI health solution, which is very different than a tool where, obviously we talked a little bit about buying, where, maybe it's an extension. Like that wouldn't, in my opinion, be a Gen AI health solution. That's more of a tool that you're using.
Got it. Helpful context. I want to go to the question, just the build versus buy decision question. And so Nikhita, I'll come to you. And I'll say Oscar is a bit notorious, and I feel like I can say this as an Oscar alum, for building internally, even when, maybe it's not always the best use of resources. So I'm curious, for you guys, what's driven the decision to build so much in-house when it comes to AI?
Yeah. I mean, obviously my answer is going to be biased, right? But I think there's a couple of things. First of all, I think Oscar's tendency to lean towards building is because one of our differentiators is the fact that we can get stuff in front of users really quickly, because we have a lot of those users internally, right? Like we've got clinicians, we've got operations people, we've also got our virtual care practice. And so a lot of times the decision is actually like, hey, we could actually probably get this in front of users and start getting early feedback and iterating much faster than a lot of the vendors that are pitching to us. And also procurement alone takes a lot of time, right? So having the ability to shortcut a lot of that, I think, is definitely a big part of it. I also think that and most people that are in healthcare can appreciate this, that there comes a point where actually knowing healthcare and healthcare operations actually matters way more than like the technical knowledge. And I think that's something that we also have a little bit of a bias towards, is like, we know our business really well. And so we know that we can build the tech stuff afterwards. But the most important thing is like knowing the operations and like being able to pick apart human processes into like bite-sized chunks. And that's something that I think we've just found that like we can do that ourselves because we're so close to the user. And then I think there's probably a third reason too, which is that like a lot of, especially with the genAI stuff, there's a lot of like synergies that you get when pairing that on top of Oscar's proprietary tech stack, right? And so we're definitely seeing that in some of our applications where we're like, actually, we built this proprietary tech stack. It leaves very detailed logs of what's happening to a claim as it adjudicates from the system. And now that we have that, it's really, really easy for us to use LLMs, for example, to navigate the logs of those systems and like make that easier to plug into other problems. So I think those are sort of the three reasons why I think we lean towards building. So yeah.
Makes sense. Do you guys ever look externally at this point or no?
We do. We definitely do. So I think when there's problems that it's not obvious that it's like, we will have that leg up in terms of like, we're closest to the operations, right? Or we're closest to the actual healthcare problem, then we will. So I think a great example are some of the like code generation solutions that are coming to the market, or things like summarizing emails or summarizing your Slack messages. So things that I see as more like kind of like industry agnostic, enterprise-wide problems. I know there's a ton of really cool startups that are doing work on that. And those are the types of things that we're always like much more open to taking a look at, seeing what's out there. And I don't think we would build that ourselves. So.
Got it. I want to come to you because I know, we talked a little bit ago, you talked a bit about a middle ground solution, on kind of the build versus buy spectrum, which is kind of the concept of working with, let's say an AI focused development shop, particularly for highly organization specific use cases. And so I'm just curious, do you see this as a viable option today? And, how would you think about going down this route versus trying to, build yourself?
Yeah, it's a great question. And Nikhita, hearing your answer, again, acknowledging bias of where I am and where I focus my time, man, I just really agree with every single point you laid out, that operational understanding is so critical to success. And so, we're a younger company, we're way smaller, we're not an Oscar, right? But we have large aspirations. And so, my CEO was faced with the decision of what is the option set, and one is to wait for product offerings to emerge. I think it's still early days in terms of really viable healthcare genAI related solutions that are plug and play, but they're happening and they're going to continue to happen, and there's going to be successive waves and they're going to improve. So you could wait for those, take them as they come, evaluate. The other is to do what you brought up, Bobby, which is like a AI focused dev shop. So this is basically taking kind of a lot of what Nikhita was talking about and just adding someone externally that does the wiring up of these foundational technologies, right? So, Matt, you brought up that building a genAI solution doesn't involve building a foundational model. Like, that's true. Building a chatbot that references your data and uses retrieval augmented generation, like there's a company now that sells RAG pipelines, right? So like you don't necessarily have to buy a RAG pipeline to be building an AI solution. And then you have these dev shops, right? Which, it's like a couple smart product people, a couple engineers whipping stuff up that can leverage your operational knowledge, basically get the mojo that Nikhita's describing, but you don't have the resources that Nikhita has because you're like 3 years old. And then the third option, which is the option he went with, which is why I'm here, is to basically hire someone to navigate this internally. And so what I've discovered is there's a lot of use cases that remarkably me on my own as a non-technical person or me plus a contractor can build all sorts of crazy stuff that's incredibly value added and fast and effective. So basically the decision for the third path was, let's look at products as they emerge. In the meantime, let's build what we need to build. And we can always I'm the person that helps us navigate that terrain over the next few years, because we really don't know how fast things are going to evolve other than they're going to be fast, So that's kind of where we're at.
Yeah, cool, super helpful. I definitely want to circle back to some of those use cases of what you and one other person have been able to build. But let's talk for a minute about what it takes to develop the capabilities to build internally. And so, Nikhita, I want to come back to you, and would love if you could just walk us through how Oscar went about developing the capabilities to develop these solutions internally. What did you guys have when you were just getting started, and then what did you kind of develop over time?
Yeah. So I think it actually started with a hackathon, interestingly, which I think was a really smart idea because we wanted to basically do this initial hackathon last year to sort of get a pulse check from the company on like, hey, how many ideas, if we were to give a way for our internal teams to prototype with LLMs, what could we generate with that, right? And we had like a resounding success with that initial hackathon. And many of those projects actually are projects that graduated into some of our production use cases today, right? And I think that was like a really good low stakes way to get quick feedback from the rest of the company on like, is this something that we should invest more time in? I think after that hackathon was so successful, they decided to staff this centralized AI R&D team, which is the one that I'm the product manager for. And we essentially have a hub and spoke model where we need a centralized team to sort of get over the initial inertia to get early ideas tested and prototyped, and also gain that institutional knowledge as a company on how to deal with LLMs because they're so new. And then our centralized pod is also responsible for pushing those insights out to the rest of the org and passing off successful experiments and prototypes to the domain teams that can then graduate the viable ones into successful production use cases. And so we've got this very nice push and pull where there's ideas being generated both by the domain teams that then come to the centralized pod. And that's in the form of, we've got regular office hours, we've got Monday nights hacking. And then similarly, the AI pod will also push ideas out to the rest of the organization that maybe they weren't thinking about. So that's sort of how that's like the nice balance that we've settled into with respect to AI development. I will say that we're still in, I would say like the first inning of all of this, as we all are. So I'm sure this model will evolve over time, but this is where we've landed. And I think we've also staffed appropriately, right? We've staffed our centralized pod in a way such that it's relatively senior. It's people that can operate pretty independently, lots of internal transfers. So they know the business really well and can sort of shortcut some of the onboarding to the different domains as well. So that's helped us.
And was there a lot of prior expertise in kind of the Gen AI domain, or was this, we just have a lot of smart folks who are picking it up quickly and we're going to kind of figure it out?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of like the Oscar way, right? Is like, we've got smart folks that are going to pick it up and learn. I don't think Oscar would have been started as a company if that wasn't built into our ethos, right? So we very much have that attitude. And I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier, where at least we found that what actually matters is just like really deep curiosity about the human operations. Because working with the LLMs, you can always figure that out. And there's tons and tons of great research that's coming out onto the market. And we are always keeping an eye on like blog posts that have like the latest suggestions on like, here's different techniques to try. I honestly believe that the hardest part is actually like breaking down real human workflows into what we call atomic units. And I think the types of people that are really good at that are just people who are really, really persistent and curious. And I don't think that necessarily depends on your pre-existing technical knowledge, right? So, yeah.
Got it. Matthew, I want to come to you because I know when we talked to you, you also, I think, had a similar hackathon kind of story, but I'm just curious kind of for your take on how do you build this kind of AI focused culture?
Yeah, I mean, first, I want to say that I think in the past it was kind of a strategic decision. Do I have an AI first culture or do I not? And I think in this world, it's kind of, there's no choice. You have to be, because, the time, the expertise, the data you need to get the benefits of AI have dropped so dramatically that for you to even compete in this world, you have to have it. And so, what we try to do at Summer Health is to really have an ethos around having a bias towards asking ourselves for every problem that we face, can AI replace, augment, or teach us how to actually solve these problems? And so that's kind of what we, the mantra that we tell ourselves every day. And yeah, funny enough, Nikhita, we had a very similar story. And I shared a little bit of a playbook when I was at a Pocket Health conference, which is, to build it, just find someone. There's probably someone in your company already that's extremely excited about this, right? They're probably the ones posting videos of Sora or whatever. Work with them, generate some actual evidence that with a little bit of expertise and knowledge of the business domain, that you can actually generate some impact. And so, for example, it wasn't PHI, but I asked my CEO, I'm like, hey, can I use some of your conversations, hop into ChatGPT and see if I can actually generate a medical note? Within 30 minutes, I had fine-tuned the prompt where it was like, oh, this is kind of usable now, obviously not accurate by any means and not reviewed by a clinician, but enough to get the team excited. And then the third thing that we did was there are certain tools out there you can use to make it incredibly simple for people to get started. So we use like a Python, a collab notebook, kind of like a Jupyter notebook, have all the access tokens there so people can just hit play and they can get access to GPT-4, which is a HIPAA compliant platform, have access to some of the conversations so people can start iterating on it, even if they're not technical. So we had our clinician kind of go in there and play around with it and fine tune the prompts. And then similar to you, we had a hackathon, about 2 days. One of the ones obviously was medical note summarization. Another one was actually creating a chatbot that mimicked the style of one of our providers, which surprisingly was pretty good. But within 2 days, we had launched something that was more or less 80% there. And literally the week after, we just shipped it to production because we still have a human in the loop that's going to review the medical note. And I've heard solutions out there charging, I don't know, something like $100,000. Obviously, there's scale differences to use a medical note summarization. I think we spent $86 last month, and we do tens of thousands of visits. So it's just, it's definitely valuable if you can learn to build it on your own, both in terms of the low barrier to entry and also cost savings.
Yeah, it's cool. Ford, I want to come to you because I think you have a pretty interesting story as well, and I think well, at least you were, I don't know if you still are working on a little bit of a smaller team or more of a one-man band, but I'm curious, how did you kind of get into this, into this world, and any advice for folks in kind of coming up the curve on their own?
Yeah, so I mean, my story, I had been at a healthcare analytics company called Clarify Health. I was a VP in their product organization, was there for 5 years. And that had run its course, and I was thinking about what I wanted to do next. I was passionate about generative AI and was just kind of experimenting a little bit with some use cases that Soar had. So I actually know personally the CEO. I've been an advisor to the company for a long time. So we were just kind of spitballing about, well, how could generative AI help? And I started doing some research. I actually did like a vendor search for like a chatbot. And the companies I talked to were all on this archaic, decision tree chatbot architecture. And it was like, meanwhile, I go over to YouTube, it's like, build a chatbot in like 15 seconds. And so I started doing that. And I basically did a crash course in Python. I had a little bit of coding experience from some CS classes in college a lifetime ago. And I just started building stuff. And so essentially, if you can explain what you want, if you can explain requirements, you're basically coding in natural language. It obviously helps. And I'm not in any way saying that I'm like as good as a seasoned developer. So definitely not trying to say anything like that. But it is ridiculous, the stuff that I've been able to produce with a lot of dedication and passion. I mean, Matt, you mentioned like go find the person who's passionate about it. That's the stuff. It's about experimentation and excitement and passion and curiosity and a very concrete understanding of what you want. And if you know what you want and you can explain it in words, is pretty good at coding. So that's the summary, if that's helpful.
Cool. Yeah, super interesting. So I wanna shift gears a little bit and go just to what the actual process of building solutions in-house looks like for you guys. And so Nikhita, I'll come back to you and just would love to hear about, what this looks like at Oscar. How do you guys decide on use cases? How does this kind of centralized AI team that you're describing, interface with the other teams? Just any context you can kind of provide on how it actually works.
Yeah. So I will say that we have evolved our perspective on this. I think much like many organizations, when we first did the hackathon, we had a lot of ideas because the focus was like, what can these LLMs do, right? So it was very much focused on let's find use cases that these LLMs will be able to solve, versus I think now we've sort of matured a little bit and now we're looking at like, hey, what are the top problems in the business and what are the top priorities of our business unit owners? And then which ones of those are LLMs a good candidate for, right? So we kind of had started with this very bottoms up approach, which was great for helping us get initially started and getting the infrastructure and pipe set up. And now we're sort of evolving to take more of a top down approach where we're really trying to emphasize that we need all of the business leaders to actually be thinking about AI in general as one of the tools in their toolkits. And we want them to be sort of flooding us with ideas and excitement about this as well, right? And so I think it's evolving, right? Where first we started with a lot of grassroots ideas, and now I think it's a lot more like we'll actually go department by department and sit down with each of our operational leaders and literally be like, tell me what are your top 5 to 10 problems and what workflows are giving you the most pain, and let us shadow those workflows to really understand if there's an opportunity for genAI in particular to help out here. Then I think there's a little bit of early experimentation that we do after we've done that initial discovery, right? So once we compile a list of feasible ideas, we'll sit down and do very rapid prototyping and experimentation to assess feasibility and say like, hey, how far can we get in like one sprint cycle with this problem? And then usually from there, we can build a really good intuition of like, okay, yes, like this is something that we're going to spend time on because we think it's viable, or actually like we're really, really far and this is a way more complex problem for the short term. I think the models are getting better exponentially. So like, I do think that what we consider today to be very high lift is going to evolve even in the next year. But I think in general, that's been our approach. The one other thing that I will say, and I'm sure everyone else who's developing these solutions is realizing this too, is that you get like 60 to 80% of the way there with your like hacky version. And then like to get to production, you've got to solve that last 20%. And I think we definitely were very naive on how much time is required to get that last 20%, which has actually informed some of our build versus buy decisions, because we have a lot of vendors that will come to us and say, look, we're at the like 60 to 80%. And then now we're able to say like, yeah, so are we. And we know how long it takes to go that last 20%, 20 to 40%. And so we're working through that, I think. But yeah.
Interesting. Has that influenced what use cases you guys go after? Like, I mean, for example, one of the questions in the Q&A was, maybe do you look more at like internal use cases versus things that are member facing or patient facing, just kind of given the scope for error issues? Yeah, I'm curious.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think we have started with internal use cases, much like everyone else, because obviously in our industry, the stakes are a lot higher if you put something in front of a patient and get it wrong. And so we found using internal use cases good because it simultaneously will provide value to the business, but also it's a really good way for us to get early feedback because a lot of our internal teams are actually really close to the members. So they actually do know what types of questions that a member is going to ask. But yeah, absolutely, that's been a consideration for us. And I think that's probably true for, anyone that's like in the healthcare domain. That's not unique to Oscar.
Makes sense. Actually, a good segue forward. I want to come to you, and I'm curious how you, on your side, as you're building these solutions, involve some of your other teammates, frontline clinicians, kind of in the process, and make sure that it's going to be something that kind of actually works for them in their, in their day to day.
Yeah, I mean, to go back to Nikhita's first response and talking about how building yourself, you have access to your users on a way that outside vendors just, you can, as an outside vendor, you can have like a working team that joins every once in a while, and definitely do that if you're trying to build product as a vendor. But like, I look back at my experience as a product person externally versus internally, and it's just astounding how much higher the fidelity is when you're building internally and how much more effective you can be. And so we work extensively with our users, whoever's going to be using whatever it is that we're doing. They're personally invested, I'm personally invested, and it leads to really great results. So like one example, one of the things that I built, it's not an LLM isn't in the loop of this solution. This is an automated scheduling algorithm, but it's doing a very elaborate scheduling process. So these kids, they come to the center, their time is broken into 4 blocks throughout the day. Each one of those blocks needs an individual clinician assigned to it. And who's the right clinician at the right time is, I mean, if you want to get fancy, it gets complicated very quickly. And understanding what sorts of scheduling constraints are critical versus nice to have. For the nice to have, how do those things stack up against each other? Looking at outputs and results and seeing how to build and iterate based on that is all a process. So, every time I'm actually I'm a user now, so I'm building the schedules every week for one of our centers, and as one of the schedulers, I'm going into the clinician review meeting where we review the schedules, and they're giving me feedback, and that's directly translating into how we enhance what we do. And, one of our priorities initially was fill every block, right? Like, we want to make sure there's no, gaps in the schedule, because this mental Tetris is so hard for humans to do and even bad algorithms to do. We want to fill the blocks. Well, it turns out that the cost of filling the last like 1 to 2% of the blocks in terms of the quality of all the other blocks is super dramatic. Now, what does quality mean? It's a measure that I didn't even understand until interacting with the clinicians very closely to say, what is quality? And a vastly higher quality schedule is one that meets this list of important constraints at the cost of 1 to 2% of blocks being unfilled and filled manually through a different process. That is like infinitely better. And I wouldn't have known that otherwise. And my algorithm would have been mercilessly breaking up teams and reassigning teams in a way that would have driven everyone insane had I been an outside vendor and not had the opportunity to really engage at that level.
Makes a ton of sense. I want to come back to this, what Nikhita brought up in terms of this, getting 60 to 80% of the way there relatively, straightforward. Is that last 20 to 40% that's really tough. And Matthew, maybe I'll come to you on this. I'm curious to get your perspective on this topic. What is it that makes that last 20 to 40% so hard? How do you deal with that? What's the point at which you're comfortable enough to actually put it into production? Any context there would be interesting.
Yeah, it's definitely say the toughest question for me. No, I'm gonna reveal the secrets of the world. Now, I think it's obviously challenging to close the gap on the 20%. And I'll just make 2 points. One on why that is kind of a checkbox on why you might want to build versus buy, and then second, tactics to get closer to that, let's say 10%. For the first thing is, that's kind of the problem with buying vendors, right? You get an output that is 60% of the way there, and you have no influence on how to iterate on that to get it closer to 90% or 95%. And that's why any solution that we build, similar to Forward, the clinician is right at the beginning. They're actually like, LLMs are the most useful when they're paired up with the expert, the domain expert, which in this case is the clinician, especially for a lot of medical use cases. There's been research, and I can share it with you, Bobby, later, where there are papers that have shown GPT-4 with dynamic few shot prompts examples, chain of reasoning can perform on par, if not better than a medical based LLM like Google, for example. Obviously, Google's continuing to improve, but like at that time, the context tuning is so key. And so that's a good segue to the second part, which is the way that you close the gap is, one, always picture that there's a human in the loop, right? Because they can always close that gap because humans are able to make those conjectures. The second is that if you can capture those choices that the end user is making, so maybe they're making edits to the output, or maybe they're choosing one input over another, you can actually update your context window and tune it. And then the second thing is use a ton of examples, more examples than you think, especially now that the context windows have increased from, again, 10,000 tokens, which used to be about 30 pages of content, to 1 million tokens, which is like 3,000 pages. The amount of accuracy that can be achieved by just putting more information in the context window, the foundation model, is astounding. And that's only going to increase over time. And then, Bobby, maybe this is a separate webinar, but the emergence of agents, LLM agents, is a really exciting topic. And we're seeing some papers out from Hippocratic AI around Polaris, their kind of architecture, that I think is going to continue to help us get closer and closer.
Cool. Let's definitely come back to that. I think that'll be interesting. And maybe that will be a future webinar. We'll see if the conversation goes well. I do want to. I'll just put this in the group. So if anybody wants to jump in, we got a lot of questions in kind of the run up to this around, how do you manage kind of the data concerns around this, whether it's HIPAA compliance or security? Is there anything that you guys would share about, for people who are just starting to get started here, what they should be thinking about or specific steps they should take?
I can start with this. This has been a challenge because we want to simultaneously be using the best models while also making sure that everything should be HIPAA compliant if it's touching PHI, right? And I have to say that I think it is our duty as healthcare companies to apply pressure to the vendors and the folks that are in the research community to make sure that when they release models, they are also thinking about how that's going to be able to be plugged into healthcare use cases. And I think a really tactical way for companies to do that is Oscar worked on these White House voluntary commitments, and I can share that link, but any company that's within healthcare should think about signing on to those commitments. And I think there's a lot of great regulatory pressure as well. And I think the best way that we can push this forward is by making it very, very clear what are the applications and what's the value at stake with the genAI, right? But I actually do think this has been a challenge, is that we have had some models where we're like, we can't use this because this isn't HIPAA compliant, right? And we're not going to put our members at risk. So I think we need to work on that, honestly.
Yeah. Matthew Ford, anything you guys want to add here?
No, I think she covered like the importance of pushing it forward, because you're obviously limited to the vendors that can sign BAs because they have a zero data retention policy. And so, yeah, it is limiting. And so, yeah, whatever lobby you have, Nikhita, let me know.
I'll add one more thing, which is, and maybe this is blindingly obvious, but if you don't need to feed PHI to the LLM, don't feed PHI to the LLM. So most of our use cases that involve PHI, the PHI we're talking about is a first name, maybe a last name. And you can use software locally to pull that out of whatever you might feed to an LLM. And then even sometimes you don't even need to add it back, but you could add it back. So none of our solutions actually send PHI to an LLM currently. I mean, we're not necessarily in a position where we'll say we're not going to do that because, there's BAAs plus all the efforts that Nikhita and Matt have been describing are the things that are going to get us to where we ultimately will be, which is where this stuff is is rock solid. But yeah, don't just flippantly send PHI. That's my advice. That's helpful.
Always good advice. Awesome. I want to transition for a little bit into just specific use cases because I think it's interesting to dive into what you guys have actually built. So Nikhita, I'll come back to you. Do you mind walking us through, a use case that you guys have tackled at Oscar?
Yeah, so there's two, right? So we talked a little bit about sort of like our internal users, and I think the biggest use case there, which you guys may have seen on our blog, is our claims assistant. So, one of the things that Oscar has decided to build in-house is our tech stack to adjudicate claims. And the great thing about that is it's highly configurable, which means it's super, super flexible. I think when COVID happened, we were like one of the first payers that was really quickly able to accept like credit card payments. And that was in large part because our claim stack was just so configurable and it was in-house. We just had a couple engineers that were able to land some diffs and then we were ready to go, right? But what that means is that because it's so configurable, the logs of the system are very, very complex and cumbersome to comb through. And so we built this claims assistant, which internally has a very affectionate name called Ossibot. And that basically will navigate the logs of the claim system and then surface insights to our processing teams who are handling tickets and questions about claims. So that's been great because I think there's around 4,000 tickets, I think, that we expect that we're going to be able to automate the investigation of in the next year. That's sort of the internal side. I think that the other side is sort of more along the clinical use cases where we have a bunch of very tedious workflows for our virtual care practice, where we've been basically piloting GPT to help out with summarizing encounters or helping draft lab results, right? And then the provider will review that and then basically sign off on it. So there's human in the loop, but it's taking time out from their schedule that currently is like for these very manual and tedious tasks. And that I'm very excited about because we've seen like 30 to 40% time savings in those workflows. And that is probably the first stepping stone to a much longer path that all of us are on, which is actually going to deliver real meaningful changes in the industry, right? Because like ultimately, if you can make the provider more efficient, that's actually going to bend the cost curve and make it so that you don't have to wait months for a specialist appointment, right? Or you don't have to like wait months to get your lab results back. So those are the use cases that I'm very, very excited about. And it's very promising that we've actually seen real-time savings for our clinicians. I'm curious to hear about other folks though.
I want to ask, I'll come back to it. Yeah. Why don't we come to you? I know you've talked in the past about some of the retrieval augmented generation use cases that you guys have dug into, but I'd just be curious if there's any that, anything that you'd want to highlight.
Yeah, I mean, that whole 80% gets 100% dilemma. It's a lot of conversations that I've been in or been privy to around like genAI and, oh my God, genAI for our company, and we're going to do genAI. They tend to live at this 30,000 foot level. And at that level, like there's a lot that can be done. I mean, you can walk outside, throw a rock and hit someone who works at a company that would benefit from genAI. But the specifics are what define the difference between that 80%, that beware of demo, Bobby, that I brought up. Like building a prototype that looks like it does the job is really quick. It's getting that thing to consistently day in, day out deliver the results you want is tricky. And so when it comes to a chatbot, right? So this is like build a chatbot on your data, right? There are a lot of components that go into this thing called a RAG pipeline. I won't go into the details. It's very interesting. Matt's point on context window might render RAG eventually pointless anyway. But what you're able to do is take a bunch of documents and allow a chatbot to interrogate them. And at Soar, just like a lot of companies, we have a ton of internal documentation. And the actual frontline clinicians, there's a subset of them that we actually train ourselves. So if you imagine, these are entry-level positions that, we have a rigorous training program we send them through. There's all this documentation. But then they're out on the floor, they're with kids, and they need answers to questions quickly. And so the ability to interrogate a chatbot that will automatically go into hundreds of pages of training manuals and find the information they need is super attractive. Here's the challenge, though. So when you think about RAG in the context of this use case, what if it gives you an answer that's great, an answer that's great, and then the third or fourth answer is like a little suspicious? It looks a little weird. It's probably right, but maybe not. And your boss, who you have been asking all the questions to, is right there, just like right over there. You can just run over there and ask. The barrier to going around your solution and doing the thing that you're trying to build the solution to fix is so low that you need to build a chatbot that the retrieval is like 99%, 99.9%, because their recourse is right there, right? Now, if you were to compare the exact same technology, the exact same infrastructure, the exact same use case, but the difference is this is a researcher, right? Mm-hmm. Or like, let's say it's a revenue cycle management use case, right? There's some long tail of payers that you need to bill with, and, you know, goddamn, they have like the same 200-page manual for billing as like Cigna does. And they represent less than 1% of your claims. And some poor schlub is like looking through this PDF to figure out how you bill for this PT appointment. And like, oh my God, right? Now, if that thing is right 4 times out of 5, and all you have to do is re-ask the question maybe with a little bit more words, that researcher is gonna, you know, kiss your feet and be like, oh my God, you saved my life, right? Same tech. The retrieval, the barrier for retrieval for that could be 80%, 70%, right? So that's another variable here, is that the specifics of your use case determine the rigor that the tech needs to be at in order for it to actually be successful.
Yeah. +1 to that.
So how do you deal with that in practice? Is that just, you know, building it, starting to work with, you know, frontline clinicians to see, like, is this working for you? Is it just maybe it's obvious and intuitive? I'm just curious how you practically deal with those differences.
I mean, you try to assess it up front, and you get better at assessing, right? So, you know, when we're choosing projects, we look at the technical difficulty, the value, and the risk, right? The risk that it, you know, we get to 80% and we never quite get to the end. And so you try to evaluate those things up front. You try to get examples out up front. Like we launched a pilot with a subset of the RBTs, registered behavior technicians, relatively quickly. And we told them that it was beta, and we log every question they answer, and we log every answer that was provided. And then I actually send everything. It's like LLMs on LLMs on LLMs to automatically evaluate the quality of the RAG pipeline. But yeah, you just try to de-risk it as quickly as possible.
Makes sense. And we had a couple of people ask if there's any best practices that you guys actually have for adoption from frontline users. Has there been any kind of hurdles to getting clinicians to use, or other, you know, frontline folks to using these solutions, and anything you kind of learned going through that process?
So really quick for us, because one of our first use cases was medical note summarization. Honestly, they loved it. And Nikhita, to answer your question, it used to take a clinician maybe like 5 to 6 minutes to write their medical note, like review the conversation, you know, write up some notes. And usually it ended up in like, I don't know, 2 sentences, like not that useful for the parent who's for a connoisseur pediatric care telehealth platform. Once we implemented this, though, it dropped from about 5 minutes to less than a minute. And the most important thing was that because it used to take 5 minutes, people would batch it. So the medical note wouldn't be sent to the parent until, I don't know, 48 hours later. And now the medical note is now being sent probably within 30 minutes of the conversation closing, because it's just so much easier for them to go through it. Then the problem is you have the opposite problem, which is the output is so seemingly good. Sometimes the doctor does not review it as accurately as they should. And so we start to track how long they are reading the note to actually sign it off. And if they don't, then there's a flag, and we review it and you know, make sure it's accurate before we send it out. But that is kind of the the excitement that we've seen from our clinicians have been pretty amazing.
We have built an internal version of our playground, but it's basically HIPAA compliant, right? And that is like our version of a ChatGPT playground. And it is accessible to all of tech and a large portion of non-tech folks in the org. And that was something that Mario has been very vocal about, which is that we need to democratize this technology across the org to make sure that everyone is able to think about how this will impact their work and their day-to-day quality of life, right? So I think that was very successful. I will say that one of the first things we had to do was deal with the concerns of like, hey, how do we make sure that someone isn't going to pass PHI through here? And so I think we've gotten over that hurdle, but I think that helped a lot with adoption. The other thing that we have found successful is we've got those weekly office hours that I've mentioned. And those are both that as well as a Monday night hacking session. And both of those forums are supposed to be open for anyone at the company to basically show up and ask questions about AI or come up with ideas that they've had and say like, hey, I've thought about this. What are your thoughts? Or even like show off something that they've been working on. And then the last thing that I'll say is I am a huge fan of just like demos. I think it's like so much more effective to get people excited if you show up with a demo that they can actually like play around with rather than like a slide deck that's trying to like pitch something to them and like make the case. And so I think I've definitely found that when we show people demos, they get really excited and it's a lot easier for them to think like, oh, now I have this idea of how I could have something similar, but for a problem that I've been thinking about in my domain. So that's another thing is like prototypes and demos are really powerful for us, at least we found.
We have about 10 minutes left. I want to do one quick lightning round and then see if we can tackle a few more of the key questions in the Q&A. As part of this, I'm going to come back to you, Matthew, first, and just curious to hear you say a couple words about kind of the agents that you were mentioning, 10 minutes ago or so, and kind of where you see that going.
Yeah, I think that there is something interesting about this. So right now, at least for us, and this is where we're starting to experiment, where it's a very simple, like one request, one prompt, sometimes RAG, sometimes just increasing the context window and then output. But I think that there's a world where you have these kind of microservices where there's a different agent that does just one thing, right? Just one thing, like one agent, all they do is they summarize medical notes. And there's one agent that is trying to help a provider get caught up really quickly. And so you can imagine that there's a workflow now that every time there's a new visit, we then hit this agent that just summarizes medical visit notes. They do the output to this person that gives a past 3 visit recap. And then suddenly you get kind of a combined workflow. And so there's all these interesting ideas of having like these multiple steps and these agents that constantly live that you can just hit for different types of use cases. So yeah, I'm really excited about that world. And so that's something that we are kind of building right now and having a bit of a co-pilot. And I just wanted to give a quick plug to MedPlum, great service for open source EHR. They make it accessible with APIs and logs and everything because we track everything to make sure that we're constantly updating our context window.
Cool. Ford and Nikhita, I'm just curious to hear what you guys are most excited about looking forward.
There's a whole bunch of use cases around information that's in the EMR and helping understand the quality of that information, the robustness of that information, where there's opportunities to work with whether it's individual clinicians or groups that might not be at the standard that we might want. There's so many micro examples within that domain that's really exciting that we're looking at. I mean, Matt, you mentioned a note drafter. That's something that we're working on too. It's a little different in our case because we have very structured data that's super consistent that we use to build the note. It's easier, I would imagine, than what you've been able to accomplish. So those are, in terms of clinical excellence, there's just so much there. And then on the ops side, it's really about automation more than AI, but using AI to rapidly build, prototype, deploy, iterate. I mean, I remember being a product guy with an engineering team, the negotiation that you inevitably enter into, where it's like, I realize I need a feature. That feature, it would have been great to have known about when we first built the requirements, but I didn't know about it, and here we are. And then you get into this discussion about, is it worth it? Is it worth it to go back because we could be working on other things? Like literally in my construction of that sentence, ChatGPT has already spat out the code you need to integrate. It's like, oh, there's 10 places where you need to adjust the code. Here it is, bop, bop, beep, 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 and then it's done, right? And so that's another piece, is the ability to automate processes, change code, basically tailor to your organization. That is just like a whole incredible world. It's not an LLM in the loop of the solution, but it's driving the build.
Yep.
Yeah, I think for me, there's probably two things. I think one is actually going back to this, like, the last 20%. We have found cases where when we're working on that last 20%, we actually look at it and realize something new about the way that humans were doing it in the real world that we didn't know before. And I think that to me is not talked about enough, but like a very powerful capability of these LLMs is to actually show us where there's things that we might be doing suboptimally, or the decision that we came to in the real world actually wasn't the right way to do it. And you only discover that when you can see the conclusion that the LLM came to, and you see that it disagrees with the way that we think the world should work. And then for that 20%, you literally look at the data and look at examples and interrogate the way that you assumed that the real world should work, right? So I think we've actually found cases and where when we're looking at that last 20%, we get this huge insight that actually the way that the world is currently working today is suboptimal. So that's something that I think people don't talk enough about, because we're always talking about just like automating and how do we like get the LLM to do exactly what the human is doing. But there's sort of this other perspective, which is like, let the LLM do what it's doing and then look at where that disagrees with what the human is doing and what can you learn from that, right? I think that's very beautiful. And I'm very excited about more applications where we uncover insights like that. I think then the second thing is similar to Ford, what you were saying, which is about the medical record, because medical records today is like, they capture the messiness of the patient's journey and is like currently a very, very difficult data source for us to do anything with it. And I think LLMs uniquely unlock something with respect to the medical record that was previously totally untenable in healthcare. And so I think that's also an area of R&D that we're very, very excited about, because it's like a stepwise increase in the capabilities for the entire ecosystem, in my opinion. So.
Very cool. Anything you can share there? I'm just curious, what are some of the things that you're excited about? Yeah, what you're excited about being able to do.
Yeah, I mean, so for one thing, just like answering a question about a medical record, right? Like being able to say like, what medications is this patient on? And there are some medical records that for our sickest patients are like over 500 pages. And so there's also a little bit of this bias in the system where if I'm a provider, then it is super, super cumbersome to scroll through the medical records for my sickest patients, right? And so being able to answer questions about, in particular, those really, really long medical records, I think is super important, because you're going to solve an access problem that exists today, right? It's a structural access problem. So that's one thing I'm really excited about, is like, how do we deal with the really long records? And I do think that like the longer context windows that we're seeing and will continue to see is definitely going to help with that too. So I'm very, very excited about that too.
Got it. Cool. Well, we just have a couple minutes left, so I didn't do a good job leaving time for additional Q&A. I'm quickly looking here. Yeah, there's one question on medical, kind of to the point we were just talking about on medical summarization. so many off the shelf options. Can you elaborate on what models you used or what the process was like? Anything that any of you guys could share about summarization, because I think it is such a common use case, but also one that seems to me to be potentially risky in terms of missing key information or the risk of hallucination. So if any of you guys have worked on these types of solutions so far, I'd just be curious to hear any insights.
Yeah, maybe just really quick for us, just to be really practical on, kind of what worked for us was for us, we are a asynchronous platform. So we can actually capture the entirety of the conversation and place it into the context window. So that, again, that helps ground everything. The second thing that we were able to do is we basically include up to 10 examples of conversations and the output of what we consider a good summary. And that's something that our clinicians iterated on to a point where he felt that it had approximately like 90% accuracy in terms of the output that we were getting. And then the third thing is that, as I mentioned, we do track how fast someone reviews a medical summary before they sign it off. And so if it is too fast, that just means that, clearly they didn't review it. And then if it is, and then the third thing is the last thing is we actually track the edits. And so we can track the accuracy of it and then we continue to update the examples. So just and again, we are using GPT-4 for that. Although something that's interesting is we just gain access to MedLM from Google. And it's interesting to see the differences in output in terms of the clinical terminology used. And I actually think there's a world where you kind of use both because GPT might be a lot better at summarizing the emotions and feelings and concern from a parent, but the MedLM might be better at understanding the provider because they're obviously using more kind of medical terminology or clinical pathways. And so the combination of these, which we haven't tried yet, might be an interesting next evolution of this medical note summarization.
Cool. Well, I know we're at time. This has been awesome. A huge thank you to all three of you guys. I feel like we could keep asking questions for a while, so we might need to do a round two at some point. But this was awesome. Really appreciate everyone's time. Thanks everyone for joining the webinar.